The room was tense before she even spoke. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their chairs, the way the murmurs slowly died down as eyes turned toward the front. Justice William Alsop sat there with the calm authority of a man who had spent decades on the bench, and his reputation preceded him. He wasn't just another judge. He was a man who had seen it all, heard it all, and didn't hesitate to put anyone in their place with a few choice words. And when Jasmine Crockett stepped forward to deliver her argument, he leaned back in his chair, raised his eyebrows, and smiled in that way only someone supremely confident can. But as Crockett began to speak, as she laid out her points with precision, something unexpected happened. Instead of responding with seriousness, instead of engaging her reasoning, Alsop let out a laugh. A sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed in the room like a slap across the face. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Journalists in the back scrambled to capture every detail. It was the kind of laugh that could unnerve even the most experienced attorneys. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She stood taller, her eyes fixed on the judge, and with a voice that carried equal parts fire and composure, she delivered a reply that silenced the room. What followed was more than just a courtroom exchange. It was a clash of worlds. On one side, an established figure of power who believed his years on the bench gave him the upper hand. On the other, a woman who had fought her way up from places most people don't even see, who carried the weight of not just her own story, but of countless people who had been dismissed and underestimated. This wasn't about ego. This was about principle. As Crockett spoke, you could feel the energy in the room shift. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words landed with precision, dismantling the assumptions behind Alsop's laughter. But Crockett smiled, just a small, knowing smile that seemed to throw him off balance, and then carefully repeated her point in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The courtroom wasn't just listening anymore. They were leaning in, captivated. They weren't watching a clash of power versus inexperience. They were watching a masterclass in composure under fire. What made it even more compelling was the way Crockett carried herself. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't angry. She was steady. She was unshaken. And in that steadiness, she revealed something the judge couldn't take away: control. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was undeniable. With every exchange, the balance of power shifted, little by little, until the very person who tried to corner her now looked like the one struggling to keep control of the narrative. Those watching could feel it. The air had changed. Even the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads realized they weren't just documenting a routine court argument. They were witnessing a moment where history seemed to pause, where a woman who had been underestimated was proving, in real time, that she could not be dismissed. And then came a moment that no one expected. Alsop, still determined to break her momentum, interrupted her mid-sentence with another sharp question, his voice carrying authority meant to cut her off completely. But Crockett didn't yield. She paused, let the silence stretch just long enough to make the interruption feel awkward, and then continued, finishing her thought with a force that was impossible to ignore. That single choice, choosing not to let herself be silenced, was the spark that changed everything. It was no longer just about arguments and counter-arguments. It was about respect. The audience wasn't just hearing her words anymore. They were feeling them. And for the first time, you could see it in Alsop's face, a flicker of recognition that he was no longer in full control. Moments like these don't happen often. They aren't scripted. They can't be planned. They erupt when someone refuses to bow to pressure, when someone has the courage to stand their ground even when the odds are stacked against them. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just holding her own. She was turning the tide. And yet, the battle wasn't over. What came next would test not just her arguments, but her endurance. Because when authority feels its grip slipping, it doesn't back down. It fights harder. And that's exactly what was about to happen next. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. Justice Alsop straightened his posture, his expression hardening as though he realized that this was no ordinary exchange. He had tried to laugh off her argument. He had tried to corner her with sharp questions. But now, as Crockett held her ground with unwavering calm, he resorted to something far more aggressive: escalation. His tone sharpened, his voice grew louder, and each question carried a sense of finality, as though he was determined to end the standoff once and for all. But Crockett wasn't shaken. She leaned into the storm with a presence that was almost disarming. She didn't match his volume. She didn't rush her words. Instead, she became even more deliberate, as though every sentence she spoke was a stone laid firmly in place, building an unshakable foundation beneath her feet. Her voice carried clarity, but it also carried conviction, and conviction is something that no gavel, no robe, no title can easily dismiss. Reporters scribbled furiously, some of them pausing to glance up, knowing they were watching a rare moment. Clerks exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whether to side with the authority of the bench or the undeniable strength of the woman standing before it. This wasn't just another courtroom exchange anymore. It was a duel of wills, and for the first time, the outcome didn't feel predictable. Alsop tried another tactic. He questioned her credibility. He leaned on his years of experience, his decades on the bench, and implied that someone like her simply lacked the knowledge to challenge his reasoning. It was a strategy designed to cut deep, to remind everyone of the imbalance in status and power. But Crockett didn't flinch. She looked directly at him and replied with a quiet confidence that carried more weight than any shouted retort ever could. She reminded him, and everyone listening, that truth doesn't bend to seniority. Facts don't crumble under years of authority. That moment broke through the walls of the courtroom. It was bigger than the legal argument at hand. It became symbolic of something that so many watching had felt in their own lives: the feeling of being dismissed, talked over, underestimated. And in Jasmine Crockett, they saw what it looked like to push back without losing composure, to answer power not with fear, but with fierce dignity. Alsop's face revealed a shift. That small flicker in his eyes betrayed the fact that he knew she wasn't going to break. And the harder he pressed, the more her resolve shone. Her replies weren't just answers, they were lessons. They exposed flaws, revealed contradictions, and reminded everyone that even authority must be held accountable. And then came the moment that froze the room. After another attempt to dismiss her point, Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but piercing, and delivered a line so direct, so undeniable, that the room fell into a silence heavier than before. Even Alsop hesitated, his rebuttal stalled on his lips. It wasn't just that she had answered. It was that she had shut down the very premise of his challenge. The courtroom sat suspended in that silence. The sound of pens scratching had stopped. Even the air felt still, as though everyone knew they had just witnessed a turning point. And for the first time, it wasn't the judge who looked like the authority in the room. It was Jasmine Crockett. What happened in that moment wasn't about winning or losing an argument. It was about something deeper, the undeniable truth that respect is not given because of a title. It's earned through the strength of your words and the steadiness of your presence. Crockett had proved both, and in doing so, she had shifted not just the room, but the narrative itself. But battles like these don't end with a single exchange. What came next would reveal the true impact of her courage, not just inside that courtroom, but far beyond its walls. When the courtroom doors finally opened and the session came to a close, it wasn't just another case moving quietly into the archives of legal history. People walked out of that room, carrying with them a memory they wouldn't forget. The image of Jasmine Crockett standing tall, unshaken, her words cutting through layers of authority, was etched into every witness. Reporters hurried to file their stories, their headlines already forming. Not about Justice Alsop's dominance, but about the young woman who had stood her ground and shifted the power dynamic right before their eyes. Justice Alsop, usually the commanding presence, left with fewer words than expected. His laugh, the one that had opened this exchange, now lingered in memory as the moment that set the stage for his own silence. Crockett's fierce reply wasn't just a counter. It was a mirror, showing him and everyone else that dismissiveness has consequences when faced with truth and composure. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited. Microphones extended toward her, eager for a statement. And though many expected her to capitalize on the moment, to gloat or to grandstand, she didn't. Instead, she spoke with the same calm conviction she carried inside. She talked about fairness, about the importance of being heard, about standing firm when it would be easier to stay quiet. Her words weren't about herself. They were about everyone who had ever felt silenced or dismissed. That's why the story spread far beyond legal circles. It wasn't just politics, it wasn't just law, it was human. People across the country saw in her something rare, someone who refused to shrink under pressure. Social media lit up with clips of the exchange. Viewers replayed the moment when Alsop laughed, and then the moment when Crockett turned that laughter into silence. It became more than a courtroom battle. It became a symbol of resilience. For days, conversation swirled. Some debated the legal points, others critiqued the judge, but most were captivated by her presence. They saw a woman who reminded them that courage isn't about shouting louder. It's about standing firmer. It's about choosing not to break when someone tries to dismiss your voice. And in that sense, the lesson reached beyond politics, beyond law. It reached into living rooms, classrooms, workplaces. Because everyone, at some point, faces their own version of a courtroom. Everyone knows what it feels like to be underestimated, laughed at, or cornered. And everyone dreams of finding the strength to stand tall in that moment, to respond not with anger, but with clarity, not with fear, but with fire. Jasmine Crockett showed that it can be done. She proved that the weight of authority is not enough to silence truth, and that sometimes the most powerful answer is not the loudest one. It's the one delivered with unshakable conviction. So the next time you find yourself in a moment where the world seems ready to dismiss you, remember that scene. Remember the silence that followed her words.